the CEO and founder of Anthosa Consulting. So Travis, you want to give a quick intro, and then Chamara, you can as well.
Hey, everybody. Good to be here. I'm Travis. I started a company called Resourcely 2.5 years ago. We exist to provide developer self-service, make it just really fast, simple, and easy for developers to do the right thing in cloud without having to become cloud experts. My background's all in security, so I've loved security ever since I was a kid. Great to be here. Appreciate the time.
Awesome.
Thanks, Travis. Hi, guys. My name is Chamara Somaratne, and I started Anthosa 6 years ago. And the main reason behind I've started Anthosa was I saw there was a huge gap between strategy and execution in most customers that I worked with in my 25 plus years up until then. And when I started Anthosa, what I wanted to do was close that gap between strategy and execution and make sure that organizations can move with speed and drive outcomes rapidly. So what we are is about making sure that organizations are not only planning well and strategizing well, but also making sure that we are executing and driving outcomes and in a meaningful way, and also helping organizations move with agility.
And you're probably wondering too, why are we here talking? And so the topic today is how to avoid costly mistakes in infrastructure provisioning in the age of AI. So first, I'd like to just direct us there, have us talk a little bit about some challenges around infrastructure as code, and then how that might impact people who are trying to adopt AI. And then we'll get into a little bit more in depth, maybe some background on infrastructure as code. And then finally, we'll talk about how maybe we could solve some of those problems. So first, what I want to talk about is infrastructure as code adoption. Why is it hard? So, Travis, you've got a lot of experience in this area. Yeah, why can't we seem to do it successfully, or are people doing it successfully?
Yeah. So first of all, why do we even care about infrastructure as code? The reason I believe is because we've gone from basically single parties doing things in cloud. So back in the day, you had the infrastructure team. They would just go and manage all the infrastructure for you. And now in this DevOps world, we have multiplayer. So we have software engineers that are at least partially responsible for infrastructure. And then we have other folks around them, networking, security. They're all stakeholders in the way that this infrastructure and other technology is provisioned. And so what infrastructure as code gives us is, rather than just going and doing ClickOps, we get the opportunity to submit code for review. When everything checks out, then it can get deployed. So this is why we want it in the first place. It becomes challenging for a few reasons. So first of all, you need to have technology that goes and can address infrastructure as code. You need to have a process, you need to have tooling. On the people side, you need to have education. So beyond going into a console and clicking things, there's a way that you have to write infrastructure as code. These are languages, they all have their own learning curves. And then there's the whole process around it. But I would say beyond even that, the underlying cloud is complex, and looking at it visually is one thing, but then having to figure out how to express that cloud configuration in a programming language can be very difficult. So these are some of the challenges that we've seen as folks go and roll it out.
Certainly in a consistent way too. That's probably something that's really relevant as what people care about. We've heard a lot, I think, streamlining, making sure that the things I'm deploying, especially with new services like LLM-based products come about, you want to make sure that the things are consistent. I think, Chamara, let's go to you. I think first, as a reminder, you've got a giveaway that you're going to talk about. Maybe talk about that really briefly first, and then based on maybe the context of what Travis just said, some of those challenges around adopting infrastructure as code, how does that influence people who are trying to adopt AI? And how can leaders think, maybe someone like at the CTO level, C-suite level, who is trying to weave AI into their business, how can they think about infrastructure as code challenges, given those goals?
Thanks, Chris. And about the giveaway, and I think I'll keep that as a surprise to announce at the end. So let's keep the suspense going, right? And just coming back to your question about why is it important with digital transformation? Why is it important with AI adoption? And I think the main factor here is with digital transformation and AI adoption, what you're seeing is the pace of change is becoming increasingly rapid, right? So when your designers figure out what services to build that will actually transform your business into a digital first engagement model, you can let the software engineers build the software, but that doesn't mean you have the infrastructure ready quickly, right? And in order to have the infrastructure ready quickly, you need to make sure that you have infrastructure as code. that can actually spin up new environments quickly and rapidly and go from one environment to another environment to another environment. And I think like there's a case study that I'm going to mention later in the session. This was a customer that actually went in and built a solution on one stack and then realized quickly, yeah, we need to actually do it using a different solution stack. How do we do that quickly? And I think that's the value of infrastructure as code, right? So why is it more important? And I think the importance is because you're actually spinning up multiple environments quickly and rapidly, you need to be able to make sure that you have the code that's set up to not just spin them up, but also shut them down quickly, right? So you spinning them up quickly, otherwise, and if you don't shut them down, then you have infrastructure that's running on the cloud. That's going to just cost you, right? And that's costing you an arm and a leg. And these AI resources are not cheap. If you think about AWS, SageMaker, or Bedrock, or any of these services, they cost you quite a bit. So yeah, and that's on the services layer from AWS. And if you go down to some of the infrastructure that they have for the EC2, like the Trinium chips and the Inferentium chips, right? These are very expensive resources to keep running. If you spin them up and if you don't shut them down, that's going to keep costing you a lot, right? So the importance is the fact that because now you're on OpEx model, you need the solution stack that helps you build them up quickly, but then at the same time, shut them down quickly if you don't need them anymore, right? So infrastructure as code is actually one of the quickest ways to make sure that you have the capability to actually spin it up and spin it down relatively quickly. And I think like, I'm sure Travis will get to this later in the session in terms of how Resourcely can actually help with that, right?
One of the things that you mentioned, Chamara, that got me thinking. So two things. If you write infrastructure as code, one of the benefits is it's easy to tear down. So if you went into the console and clicked a bunch of stuff and you want to get rid of it, you go back into the console and you click things and hope that you didn't forget. With infrastructure as code, if you're using Terraform, it's Terraform destroy, and you point it and the whole thing comes down gracefully. Another challenge, though, is these systems, whatever's deploying your infrastructure as code, they have to have very broad permissions to do what they do. And so you have this other problem, which is like, how do I make sure that some user isn't producing code that doesn't get reviewed and gets deployed by this highly provisioned system? It can go and make changes and do whatever. And often it's not subject to the same kind of checks and balances that other systems might be. So there's another challenge that's presented by this.
And that also, Chamara, to what you're talking about, it's just so interesting thinking about the like two forces going against each other, right? There's the desire to embed AI, across an organization, but then I think the things that you hit were really cost and governance related. Like you don't want to spend too much, and you want to make sure that you can control what like what people are actually deploying, what types of LLMs are using, for example, as one example. Anything else you can think of, like those big I guess the big drawbacks or the big potential counter effects of like, I want to embed AI, but I've got to consider cost, I've got to consider governance, anything else you can think?
I think the other fact is probably something Travis will talk about a lot later, which is the security, right? So security is paramount in the age of AI and digital transformation, because now all your information is out there, right? And with AI, there's so much more you can do, so much more that you're open to vulnerabilities, right? So if you don't have the security to make sure that your infrastructure is secure, then again, you're opening up yourself for risk, right? So those are the three key factors, obviously, the cost control, governance, and security, right? Those are the three important factors, right?
Absolutely.
With LLMs too, we've introduced the possibility that developer can just go and ask the LLM, like, how do I write Terraform for whatever Bedrock thing that I want to do? And it looks really good. The reviewer might be, okay, this developer knows what they're doing, but it's subtly wrong, or it has misconfigurations that are going to cost you money or have security problems. And so this is where, again, the guardrails thing becomes more important. You're going to have a system that goes and deterministically reviews this infrastructure as code before it gets deployed and make sure that you're not missing something that you didn't want to have happen.
When you do that, it's the most beautifully commented code you've ever seen, right? It's like it's structured really, really well, but then it'll sneak in, for example, a parameter that doesn't exist, or it'll sneak in something that is the opposite of what you actually want. Speaking from experience, by the way, today. It's funny. I just want to remind everyone too, if you have questions, add them to the panel, that use the Q&A tab. Feel free to go right in there and ask any questions in line. Travis, I want to go back to just to build on some more context, how we got here. Something you talked about, or you mentioned briefly, was console versus infrastructure as code, and how infrastructure as code lets you, tear down even a really large stack very easily and gracefully. Maybe you can talk a little bit about some more of those, or compare and contrast console versus infrastructure as code, because some of us maybe have been coming from the console. My first experience with AWS really was in about 2016 when I was deploying EC2 instances in the console and running up a huge bill, and I didn't mean to. So yeah, I guess like where have we been and how has this evolved?
Yeah. So a few things. I think when we talk to customers, we'll hear big scale environments, right? Like thousands of accounts often. And then so base level stuff like, do we have the right things in our accounts? This is where infrastructure as code comes in really handy. When you add a new account, you append a line to a file, and now all of your stuff gets stood up in the exact way. There's repeatability. Whereas if you're relying on humans and ClickOps to go and set things up, you can miss steps there and you could end up with an environment that's out of sync with everything else. So that's one benefit for it for sure, is just ClickOps is prone to error. Code, you can have deterministic reviews on it, make sure that everything's good, and it can really simplify, allow you to reuse and do things more quickly, for sure. And then on top of that, I think the multiplayer aspect is really important. So instead of developer just going into the console and doing things, and then you find out later that it was done incorrectly, before that happens, they write code, it goes through a review process, and only then it gets deployed. In many of these environments, the developers don't even have the permissions anymore to do these things. If you want to go and spin up infrastructure, change networking, whatever, that's all going to go through a review process, which is nice. It also gives you, from security, the benefit of you can centralize the permissions in one system instead of having all of your developers running around with lots of permissions. And then, yeah, just general repeatability patterns. It's basically impossible to do that if you're in a ClickOps world. But in infrastructure as code, with the right patterns, guardrails, templates, all of that, it's not only possible, but it's easy to do that. So those are the key benefits that we see when we talk to folks. I know that there's a ton of others too: reusability, maintainability, just fitting into a more standard development flow. I think we've all realized that infrastructure is critical to an organization, and keeping it going through standard CI/CD process is very important.
The Chamara, so I think that's a very feature-heavy description of what infrastructure as code is better than ClickOps and Cloud Console. When you're building a story for like senior leaders at maybe a technology company, or just anyone who maybe is currently using ClickOps or is even using on-prem and wants to move to like do a digital transformation and move to the cloud, using buzzwords. How do you build that value chain or value story from those features to like a senior leader level? And if you were to go to help someone at a customer say, we want to adopt infrastructure as code because it's going to get us these things, what type of things are you working with your customers on to tell that story?
And that's a great question, Chris. And I think like going back to what Travis mentioned earlier, right? So in a large organization, you're going to have a large number of people who are using this console if that's the way they're using a cloud, right? So that means there's going to be a lot of resources created, and you lose visibility relatively quickly, right? So and obviously these are not cheap processes; they are going to cost you a lot, especially if you look at a lot of the AI resources, right? So I think when you're trying to convince a senior leader why they should be looking at infrastructure as code as the way to spin up and tear down infrastructure, the messaging is primarily around the cost, right? And I think like the cloud model is good because it's all based on OpEx. But at the same time, if you don't have the visibility of what you're spinning up, your cost is completely out of control, right? So you need to have a better way to control that. And I think a good example of this is actually like we use AWS for a lot of our services for Anthosa consulting internally, right? And one of the team members that we were working with a while back had spun up a phone line in Virginia, right? Which I didn't even know, right? And we were paying it for nearly 3.5 years without knowing that we had actually spun up a phone line in Virginia. But I guess that's just, I mean, for us, we are a 25 people organization, so we are relatively small. But a lot of our customers are either scale ups, which are sort of like 50 to 500 employees, usually have at least 10 to 50 developers, right? And then if you look at some of the mid-sized customers that we work with, sort of 500 to 5,000 employees, they usually have in excess of 100 developers usually in the teams, right? And then if you look at some of the medium to large enterprises that we work with, they usually have hundreds of employees, very easily 200 to 500 employees or more, right? And then when you think about the scale of letting everyone actually have access to cloud and letting them provision resources, think about how you lose control relatively easily. Yes, you could put Terraform and codify a lot of it, but then you lose that single pane of glass unless you deploy some of the more expensive resources that solutions that are out there, right? And I think for me, like the value proposition I saw with Resourcely is, it gives you that single pane of glass. It gives you multi-cloud accessibility relatively easily, and also being able to use Terraform under the hood and be able to put the policies on top and put the guardrails and have the templates to create the repeatability. To me, that was actually one of the main reasons why I wanted to work with you guys, right? So I guess just going back to your original question around how would you convince a senior executive about this, I think it's about that. How do we control cost in a large organization? How do we make sure that there is governance? How do we make sure there's security across all the cloud resources that we are provisioning, right? So we go back to that same messaging that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, absolutely makes sense. And I'm really glad that you brought up developers and developer count. And we'll get back to that in a second, because I think developer productivity also plays quite a role here. But let's go back to Travis. And thank you for giving an overview on infrastructure as code. Where does Resourcely then fit in? So you've built the product. What does it allow people to do around infrastructure as code? And Chamara just kind of teed it up a little bit for you. But in summary, what is Resourcely?
Yeah, Chamara nailed it. So we see kind of this bifurcation of companies today. Some are, we want our developers to move fast. Our productivity, our innovation speed, that's top most important. And we will let them do basically whatever with some basic constraints and guardrails, and then we'll go clean it up after the fact. So tons of tools that go tell you like where you've done things incorrectly. Those teams spend a long time doing migrations, fixes for things that have already been incorrectly, and sometimes they just never get there. On the other side, we have companies where they recognize that getting things done correctly in the first place is very important. That could either be because of their risk tolerance, their governance, their regulatory requirements. And those companies suffer from slow cycle time. So I've heard, it takes weeks to get infrastructure deployed or changed or whatever. And the point of Resourcely is to give both. So enable that governance, the review, infrastructure as code, all the benefits that we talked about, but get developers out of either having to try and figure out how do they write correct Terraform themselves, or even worse, when they need something, they have to go request it from some team that's very busy, waits for a while and gets back to them. We built it as a true cloud console replacement. Actually better than a cloud console in the sense that you can have presets, values, your organizational context, but you can think of it like a super cloud console where the dangerous things have been sharpied out and we guide you towards exactly what you should be configuring. And then the output of it is Terraform. So that goes through your standard pipeline and review process. And what we've heard from customers is if they use Resourcely blueprints and guardrails, they get the fast path. So they don't have to wait. They don't have to ask anybody for help. They don't have to wait for some team to go deploy it for them. They don't have to wait for the weeks-long review process. And that way you get both. You get the innovation speed and also the correct governance, all of those requirements done.
Awesome. And so, Chamara, based on that overview, how does that align or help to solve those challenges that we started to address earlier around infrastructure as code adoption?
I think that's a really nice segue. So obviously, like Travis was talking about, how do we maintain that innovation speed, right? So like for a startup that's becoming a scale up, it's usually quite easy, right? Because for them, they usually used to moving at speed, and when they become a scale up, obviously it's a slightly larger team, and the product is getting complicated. So the need for something like Resourcely is quite obvious for them. And usually people in a startup environment, they're quite innovative. They're quite open to adopting new solutions. So they'll obviously look at something like Resourcely and say, oh yeah, this is going to help us, and they'll adopt it, right? But if we go to some of the mid-size and mid to large enterprises that we work with, for them, usually it's not just one product that they're working with. They usually have a multi-product operating model. Especially with the medium to large enterprises that we work with, the operating model is fairly complex, and they'll have multiple products that they're supporting within the organization, right? So when you look at that, then how do we actually make sure that there's a good way to prove value? There's a good way to try and have a strategy around how you roll it out across the broader product landscape, right? So how do we start that? And I think the challenge is going to be initially around, you need to convince the senior leadership. And that's usually about getting the alignment of the senior leadership and making sure that they are committed to investing on it. And then the next step is obviously once you get that senior leadership commitment to wanting to invest, then it becomes more of a, where do we start? Which team do we start with, right? And then obviously the different teams will have their own different views around which solution works better, right? So for us, that's the next step. You usually work with the teams to actually figure out what's the strategy. But we try to strategize, but not to the nth degree of detail around being detailed about the solution, but just enough so that the teams actually understand what the resource value proposition is about, and then can actually understand how it can help them. And also more importantly, we create champions that will say, yeah, I think my product is actually easy enough. I think we can actually deploy it onto my product and try it out how it works, right? So we create those champions that come in and say, yeah, if I want to take it into my area and try it first, right? And then once we do that, then we can actually kick off a pilot, right? And I think the challenge here, there's two challenges I addressed here. One is initially around the leadership alignment around, figuring out what's the solution that will help them, right? And then the second challenge is obviously around the teams wanting to pick their own. And that's usually around giving them a sense of ownership about the strategy that you're trying to deploy. So that's why we take an approach to co-designing a strategy that will help customers actually have ownership, feel like this is the strategy that we're going to deploy across our product landscape, right? And that's the thing that Anthosa is quite well known for, because we are good at actually getting that senior leadership alignment. We're good at helping the teams co-design that strategy. And once we do that leadership alignment and the co-designing the strategy, then the rest becomes easier. So when we like in our engagement service engagement pattern, we go from shape to discover to jumpstart, scale, and embed. And then in shape, that's where we actually do that leadership alignment. And in discover, that's where we co-design the strategy. And then after that, we become jumpstart, scale, and embed. That's your typical startup scaling methodology, right? So what we've done is essentially we've taken an startup methodology and applied it to an enterprise context. That's what Anthosa has done, and we've proven that this methodology actually works. Right.
And that kind of what we're sort of describing and leading into here is both a top down and bottoms up approach. What you just talked about was like defining organizational goals, like aligning those with maybe some sort of a solution, when that solution potentially being resourcely. So Travis, I'd like here to talk about Chamara talked about developers, and that made me think about developer productivity. And obviously, any organization with many developers is going to have typically some sort of a platform team with platform engineers on it. I'd like to talk, I guess, a little bit about when that execution does come in. Let's say that Chamara has helped to align from the top down organizational goals with the need to have some sort of infrastructure as code platform or way to streamline infrastructure as code deployment. What types of teams are you working with typically, Travis, and what do they care about?
Yeah, it's typically a platform engineering team, infrastructure team. One of the key metrics that we see from them is developer NPS and overall productivity. Infrastructure, it sounds like to some like the kind of thing that like maybe you only do it once in a while, but folks are often surprised when you add up how many infrastructure changes they're making and how long those things take. It's kind of the death by 1,000 cuts problem. And then on top of that, anytime when you get blocked and then you have to resume something from both the developer and these platform teams side, that really adds up in terms of cognitive load switching. So there's a ton of pain over there. Those are typically the teams that we see, and they are often gated on or measured on their ability to empower developers to move more quickly. I saw recently that Copilot has a 15% developer productivity lift, and it's one of the transformational products of our generation. We see much bigger productivity improvement than that for infrastructure changes. So it really just comes down to how often companies are making these changes, how many folks are involved, and what kind of like cycle time that they're dealing with today. I've heard anything up to weeks, which is staggering to me.
That's fascinating. And so you alluded to this as well, and you sort of cut those companies in two, right? Where they all may be platform teams, but they have really one of two big goals. Typically, it's either make sure things are going out like they expect or move faster, Is that right? And are those platform teams different at all? Are there not platform teams with one of those types of customers or scenarios?
Yeah, so in the heavily regulated case, they're often not structured as platform teams. They're more structured as like kind of governance, full service infrastructure teams. So these are the kind of organizations that status quo is when you want something, you open a ServiceNow ticket, and then at some point in the future, they get back to you and say that they have questions or your infrastructure is ready. So they are not typically platform teams. I think platform teams have the expectation that developers are going to be doing these things, and the goal of them is to make life easier for those developers.
Absolutely. Awesome. So I think it'd be really interesting, Chamara, if you're ready to talk about a little bit more detail about your strategy accelerator service. So I think you have described at a high level how you work with customers. Do you have maybe how you typically work with customers or a customer story or anything like that you can talk to us about?
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. And I think maybe before I talk about a customer use case, I'll talk a little bit about what's a strategy accelerator, right? Because what we've seen with most customers that we work with is usually some of them will want to actually like go into a pilot first and then sort of like see how the solution works before they start doing a strategy. But then what that does is then it actually influences how they think about the solution. It doesn't really give them like that broader perspective around how does this work across the organization, right? And I think like just going back to the case I mentioned earlier, like we are talking about multi-product organizations that have product-led operating models, right? So a solution that works for one particular product might not actually work for another product in that organization. And then yes, some of them might be solutions that they build themselves in-house and deploy, and some of them might be solutions where they actually products where they have the infrastructure platform built internally, but the source software is actually from an external vendor and they've configured it to adapt to the organization, right? And in some cases, it might be something completely different, cloud native or something that they're building themselves, right? So when you look at something like this, usually what we find is bringing something to the table that actually gives them a bit of a different perspective of what these different environments are that they're going into, and then talking about, when you're deploying Resourcely into your organization, we need to consider these 3 different variations, right? But 3 is probably just a wrong number. We just tell them, this is probably the wrong number, but let's start with this and then figure out what else is there, right? And the reason why we do it is mainly because we find it that when we go into these strategic co-design workshops with developers or platform engineers, they're usually people who are really good at critiquing rather than creating, right? So if we give them a blank slate and ask them to say, look, what are the different patterns, that usually creates crickets on the wall, right? No sounds at all. But if you give them something bad and let's say this is a bad strategy, but let's start with this and let's critique this and figure out how it adapts to your organization, that works really well because they're really good at tearing things down, right? Right? So for us, that's the strategy accelerator. It's basically a bad strategy that they can actually come and work with and say, how do we tailor this and adapt to our organization, right? And then once you give them that opportunity to tailor and adapt it to their organization, it becomes their strategy. They own it, right? They feel like they've created that strategy, right? And then they will support you to roll it out across the organization. So that's what the strategy accelerator and the strategy co-design work is that we do, right? We give them something bad to tear it down, and then we get them to actually support us to deploy it across the organization. And that's the best way, in my experience, that I've found that you can actually successfully deploy something in a mid-size or mid to large enterprise that we usually work with, right? So that's the accelerator in a nutshell.
There's a phrase in the US that I like to use, and it's called going to McDonald's, and it's a very similar idea, right? In that if you don't know what to do, you don't know where to go for lunch, for example, you can just suggest going to McDonald's, because people will always come up with they will have a better idea than that, right? You're presenting the bad idea for them then to say, no, actually McDonald's is a bad choice. Let's think through where we actually want to go. So that's what that made me think of. So then Travis, let's say organization's fully on board, right? Yes, we want to deploy Resourcely. And I think we all know that it doesn't always happen at once. You don't want to boil the ocean right away. Do you have any examples of how Resourcely has been adopted at first at some companies to like prove out some small wins and then has grown its footprint?
Yeah, there's some type of products that it has to be boil the ocean. It's going to do nothing until you fully integrate it. Resourcely, fortunately, is the opposite of that. So one of the reasons that I started the company, we built self-service at Netflix because we were getting just S3 and IAM requests all the time. We tracked how many of those requests we were getting and the impact to our team. Like every time we had to stop, support somebody, and we saw that that really added up. And so we built simple self-service just to get ourselves out of it. You can do the same thing in Resourcely today. You can come, go to our site, use self-service, sign up. We have blueprints out of the box. Pick one of those that you're getting requests for a lot, load that blueprint up, put some guardrails on it, and now you have a link. Anytime somebody comes and asks you for that, you send them the link. So that's always the way I'd recommend that folks start, is just take one or two high traffic patterns that you have that people regularly ask for, that you know it's right to get, it's important to get it set up correctly, and just do that for self-service. If it's working, people are going to come and say, that's great, we want these other things over there. If it doesn't work, you've put very minimal time in. What we've seen in practice is when you roll out those one or two, then people come and ask for more pretty quickly. But at that point, now you have demonstrable success. So you can come to leadership and say, hey, we already have this thing set up. We want to do more of it because our customers are coming and asking for it.
And Travis has more stories about Netflix. You can just search for the DevOps tax on Central Teams, which is a blog we wrote about those. We're going to stick with Travis, then we'll move back to Chamara for this next one. And we're getting close to the end here. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in that Q&A. So what I want to talk about is outcomes. And so let's start from the bottom where they have implemented Resourcely. What do they get? You talked about, just very briefly, like you have a link to send to somebody, but once a platform team implements Resourcely, what do they get? And then what do their users get as a result, broadly?
Yep. Yeah. So we'll go platform team first. Those are usually the people that are buying us. And what they get is they get themselves out of the ops treadmill. Instead of people coming and asking for the same thing again and again, they just get self-serve. So it's like, go do this yourself, and they get that time back. Once organizations get far enough in this, they'll just roll it into the standard process. So people can come and discover that these things exist themselves. They can come and self-serve. You don't have to even keep telling people that it exists. So that's what they get. They get their time back. Then they can go focus on other high impact things that they'd like to do if they weren't busy handling ops requests. And then what developers get is they get to actually adopt cloud at the speed that they were promised, right? Like this is what cloud's supposed to improve for all of us, is we can get things stood up quickly. We can prototype. And they get that done correctly. So they're not going to come and have security or somebody else knocking on their door in 2 months and telling them they need to go fix stuff. They just fire and forget. It's done correctly. It's according to the blessed standards. You get your thing stood up. I never had to go and ask anybody for help. And then as fast as you want to get moving on it, you get moving on it.
But I'm sure there's a meme format somewhere where it's like, if only I wasn't stuck in ops on the ops treadmill, then I could do these things I wanted to do. Just but those are blanks instead. You can put in whatever you want. Then Chamara, same question to you, but from a strategic perspective, from a business perspective. A company adopts infrastructure as code. They go through digital transformation. They have a vetted, reliable, streamlined infrastructure deployment processes. What's the value that they get as an outcome? Well, how are the internally those executives of those companies pitching that and measuring against that project?
So let me use a customer scenario and explain this, right? So one of the customers that we were working with a little while back, this was just around the time ChatGPT had become the rave, and then they wanted to actually do a bit of a pilot around building a Gen AI solution for supporting some of their customers serving staff, right? And obviously ChatGPT was the rave, and they all said, oh yeah, let's build it on the OpenAI API, and they built a solution based on OpenAI API, right? And I think shortly before they actually did like the initial go live testing, Anthropic released the Claude API, right? And the performance was a massive gap, right? And the team thought, oh, what do we do now? Because we don't want to go live with something that's sort of giving us 20% of the performance that we can get. So how do we actually quickly switch to the Claude API and get the same kind of performance that's been promised? How can we test it out, right? And the software developers said, for us, it's a simple API change. We can actually relatively easily change that, right? But then what about the infrastructure, right? That was the question, right? So having something like Resourcely at that point would have helped them immensely, right? And obviously they managed to get it done, but it took them nearly 2 weeks to try and rewrite the Terraform code to try and spin up another infrastructure stack for for the Cloud API, but they got it done in 2 weeks. But having something like Resourcely would have helped them do it in less than a couple of days, right? So that's the customer value. That's the business value of something like that. So obviously, getting that massive change that can be achieved by being simply able to provision infrastructure relatively quickly, right? And I think this is going to be more important as we go in the age of AI, because the pace of change is going to be relentless, right? So infrastructure being the bottleneck that actually slows you down is not an option for organizations anymore, right? So you need an infrastructure provisioning process that's lightning fast. And for us, I think the reason why we are betting with you guys is because we know Resourcely can do that, right? We know you guys can do that. And I've worked with a lot of other solutions out there, and I've tested them out. But I feel like, what Resourcely does in terms of your blueprints and your guardrails and the security that you provide, that's second to none, right? So for me, that's why I'm betting on you guys, right?
Awesome.
So that's the value.
I really appreciate that. So as we wait for last call for questions, I just kind of want to summarize what we've talked about so far, and then we can unveil your giveaway after that, and move into wrapping up. So we started off by talking about infrastructure as code. What is it? Why might people be using it? And then what are some of the impacts that it has on digital transformation? And then we went a little bit deeper on that. We talked about the history of infrastructure as code, and we talked about exactly how Resourcely helps us solve some of those traditional challenges. And then we moved into talking about the Chamara, your Anthosa Consulting's strategy accelerator, and thinking from a top-down perspective. So as we wrap up, I want to give each of you just an opportunity to talk about any takeaways. I'll start with Travis. We'll move to Chamara, then we'll see if there's any Q&A questions after that, and then if not, we'll wrap up. So Travis, in general, what we've talked about, I think we've nailed developer productivity and compliance and I guess stability stream or repeatability as outcomes from Resourcely. What other things do you want to add?
Doing infrastructure as code and getting things done correctly in the cloud is hard and slow, and it doesn't have to be. That's why we exist. If you're at all interested in this, come do self-serve or talk to Chamara. We love hearing about folks' use case, and we can get these things spun up really fast and show immediate value.
Awesome. And then Chamara, from your perspective, I guess, any last takeaways, and then we'd love to hear about this giveaway too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me, the giveaway is Anthosa is all about helping organizations move fast. And we see a lot of organizations that are actually, hiring consultants to do strategy that goes out there and sits on a shelf and not being implemented. Sometimes the cost proposition does not stack up. Or B, sometimes the change is not bought in by the organization. Or C, sometimes they have to go up to the board to get funding, right? And what Anthosa does is actually we figure out ways to actually break that strategy down into actionable pieces and help you get outcomes delivered relatively quickly in the organization and show value. And if you're interested in hearing more about, give us a call, right? And just coming back to the giveaway, and I kept this for the end because I think some of you may have seen on LinkedIn. Like I'm writing this book about digital transformation. It's called The Definitive Guide to Digital Transformation, and it's all about overcoming challenges to digital transformation, technology modernization, and AI adoption. And the book is going to be released sometime in the next couple of weeks. And the surprise giveaway is everyone that's actually joined the session today will get a free copy in the inbox when the book's released. So look out for that.
Awesome. Super exciting. Well, I don't see any questions in the Q&A. I think we're gonna make this video available on demand, and feel free to distribute to your friends if you'd like. We hope that you got a lot out of this. Really, I think that at the end of the day, you can learn a little bit about tying business outcomes to infrastructure as code, or about how you can solve real infrastructure as code challenges. I think those are the two different perspectives that we brought. And until next time, everybody, thanks a lot. I'm Chris. Thanks, Travis. Thanks, Chamara.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Travis. And thank you all for joining today.